Chapter 1. Death in the Greenhouse. The mist clung to the windows of Kingswood Manor like a ghostly shroud, obscuring the view of the normally pristine gardens that surrounded the grand old house. It was early spring, that uncertain time when nature appears caught between seasons, reluctant to fully commit to renewal. The weather had been particularly fickle that week, alternating between gentle sunshine and penetrating dampness that seemed to seep into one's very bones. Inside the Manor's celebrated greenhouse, however, it was perpetually tropical. The glass structure, an architectural marvel of wrought iron and crystal panes, housed what many considered to be the finest collection of orchids in England. Here, Doctor. Edwin Fallow had created his own private Eden, a hothouse jungle, where exotic specimens from the furthest reaches of the empire bloomed in magnificent profusion. Michael, do take care with that phalaenopsis. It's particularly delicate, Doctor. Fallow's precise, clipped tones carried across the greenhouse as he observed his assistant handling one of the more temperamental specimens. The presentation to the Royal Botanical Society is in 3 days, and everything must be perfect. Michael Trent, a young man of scholarly appearance with wire-rimmed spectacles and meticulously tidy hair, straightened his back, but kept his eyes on the orchid. Yes, Dr. Fallow, I understand the importance. There was a tightness to his voice that suggested more than professional deference. From the doorway, Eliza Fallow watched the exchange with the quiet attentiveness that had become her hallmark over years of living in her brother's shadow. A thin woman of indeterminate middle age, she wore her gray-streaked hair pulled back severely, enhancing the sharpness of her features. Despite the greenhouse's warmth, she had a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. "Edwin," she called softly, "Mrs. Nichols has prepared your afternoon tea. Should I have her bring it here?" Dr. Fallow waved a dismissive hand without turning. Yes, Eliza, that would be suitable. And do remind her about my special blend." "Of course, Edwin." Eliza's response was prompt, her tone carrying that peculiar note of devotion that had long characterized her relationship with her celebrated brother. As she departed, Professor Jameson arrived, bringing with him a gust of cool air from outside. A contemporary of Dr. Fallow's, with a reputation nearly as distinguished, though in somewhat different circles, he removed his hat and nodded curtly. "Fallow," he greeted, his eyes already wandering to the central display where, beneath a separate glass dome, sat Dr. Fallow's crowning achievement, a previously unknown orchid hybrid of extraordinary beauty and complexity. "Jameson," Dr. Fallow acknowledged, a hint of rivalry coloring his tone. "Come to preview my triumph before the official unveiling?" "Merely a collegial visit," Jameson replied, though his gaze remained fixed on the hybrid. "One hears such extraordinary claims about this new specimen of yours." "Not claims, Jameson. Facts that will rewrite several chapters in botanical texts." Meanwhile, in the village of Little Kingswood, a taxi brought its passenger to a halt outside a comfortable cottage with roses just beginning to bud along its garden wall. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a tweed coat and sensible scarf, paid the driver and observed her surroundings with keen blue eyes that missed very little. "Jane, how wonderful to see you." Mrs. Wellesley, a plump, cheerful woman of similar age to Miss Marple, bustled down the garden path. "I was beginning to worry about the fog delaying you." "Nothing delays the trains these days, my dear," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. "Not like during the war years. How lovely your cottage looks. Those are new curtains in the parlor window, aren't they? Reminds me of the ones Mrs. Bantry had before the unfortunate business with the vicar's cat." It was the following morning when the telephone at Mrs. Wellesley's cottage rang with alarming urgency. Miss Marple, who had been enjoying her hostess's excellent marmalade at breakfast, watched as Mrs. Wellesley's expression transformed from mild annoyance to shocked disbelief. "Good heavens, Mrs." Wellesley breathed as she replaced the receiver. "Jane, there's been a dreadful occurrence at Kingswood Manor. Dr. Edwin Fallow has been found dead in his greenhouse, among his orchids, and Inspector Graves is saying it's most unnatural, poison of some exotic kind." And the dreadful thing is, they're looking at that nice young assistant of his. Chapter 2. Village Observations. Poison, you say? Miss Marple's gentle voice belied the sharp interest in her pale blue eyes. She placed her teacup delicately on its saucer. The morning light filtering through Mrs. Wellesley's lace curtains cast a pattern across the tablecloth, not unlike the design on a particular poison bottle she had once observed in Mr. Darby's pharmacy in St. Mary Mead. From one of his own plants, they're saying. Mrs. Wellesley nodded vigorously, her double chin quivering with the excitement of having such significant news to impart. Inspector Graves mentioned something about plant toxins that only a botanist would know how to extract properly. How very interesting, murmured Miss Marple, her nimble fingers continuing their knitting. The soft click of her needles provided a rhythmic counterpoint to her thoughts. And this assistant, Michael Trent, was it, is under suspicion? Oh yes, apparently. Mrs. Nichols overheard them quarreling quite heatedly the day before. Something about proper credit for research. Mrs. Wellesley leaned forward, lowering her voice as though the walls themselves might carry her words beyond the cottage. And of course, who else would have the knowledge of such poisons but an assistant botanist? Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. It reminds me rather of the Harrington case in St. Mary Mead, before your time there. Of course, my dear. Young Mr. Harrington was so devoted to his older sister, or appeared to be, always singing her praises in public, always the attentive brother. And yet, prompted Mrs. Wellesley, when Miss Marple's voice trailed off. There was the most dreadful resentment underneath it all. Years of living in her shadow, you see. She had inherited the family home, managed the finances. He was dependent on her good graces for everything. Devotion can sometimes be the most convenient mask for darker feelings. The following afternoon found Miss Marple walking up the gravel drive to Kingswood Manor. The mist had cleared, revealing a grand Victorian house of red brick, with elaborate white trim, surrounded by immaculately kept gardens. To one side stood the famous greenhouse, its glass panes gleaming in the pale spring sunshine. "I've come to offer my condolences to Miss Fallow," she explained to the maid who answered the door. "I'm staying with Mrs. Wellesley in the village." She was shown into a drawing room where heavy velvet curtains subdued the light, creating an atmosphere of premature mourning. Eliza Fallow sat rigidly in a high-back chair, her hands folded in her lap with such tension that the knuckles showed white against her black dress. "Miss Marple," Eliza acknowledged with a slight nod. "How kind of you to call. You knew my brother." "Only by reputation," Miss Marple replied gently. "His contributions to botany were widely admired, I understand. Such a tragedy to lose someone of his brilliance." "Edwin was exceptional," Eliza said, her voice taking on a quality of rehearsed reverence that Miss Marple found vaguely familiar. His work with orchids revolutionized several aspects of hybridization techniques. He was to present his greatest achievement to the Royal Botanical Society this week. The new hybrid, yes, Mrs. Wellesley mentioned it. Miss Marple's eyes wandered around the room, noting the predominance of photographs featuring Dr. Fallow at various academic ceremonies. In each, Eliza could be glimpsed in the background, always watching, always present, yet somehow invisible. "You must have been of great assistance to him in his work." A flicker of something, pride, resentment, crossed Eliza's face before disappearing behind her mask of grief. "I managed the household. Edwin required perfect conditions for his intellectual pursuits." Their conversation was interrupted by the entrance of Michael Trent, whose harried appearance suggested recent questioning by the police. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of Miss Marple. "I apologize for the intrusion, Miss Fallow. I didn't realize you had company." "This is Miss Marple, a friend of Mrs. Wellesley's," Eliza introduced mechanically. "Mr. Trent was my brother's assistant, and being treated most unfairly by the police," Michael said, his voice tight with controlled indignation. "Yes, we argued the day before his death, but it was about the research paper. He was going to publish without acknowledging my contributions to the cultivation of the new hybrid. A common disagreement in academic circles, I imagine, Miss Marple observed mildly. Common enough, but hardly a motive for murder. Michael replied sharply. He turned to Eliza. Inspector Graves has informed me that Dr. Fallow's will leaves the entire orchid collection and research notes to the university. I thought you should know. Eliza's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly in her lap. As he always intended, the work must continue. Later, as Miss Marple was being shown around the greenhouse by the reluctant inspector, Graves, who had acquiesced only because of her friendship with his superintendent's aunt, she paused before the locked door where Dr. Fallow's body had been discovered. Most peculiar, she murmured, examining the lock. If the door was locked from the inside, as you say, Inspector, the key was in Dr. Fallow's pocket, Graves confirmed impatiently. A classic locked room scenario. Yes, quite. Miss Marple's gaze travelled to a nearby shelf where several orchids had been rearranged in a manner suggesting haste, rather than the meticulous order evident elsewhere, except that someone has moved these flowers since the death occurred. See how the water rings on the shelf don't align with the current positions of the pots, and that crushed leaf there, so recent that it hasn't yet begun to brown. Inspector Graves stared at her with growing unease. What exactly are you suggesting, Miss Marple? Oh, I wouldn't presume to suggest anything, Inspector, she replied with a disarming smile. I'm merely observing that things are not always as locked as they appear to be. Chapter 3. The Orchid Notebook. The following morning dawned with a clarity that seemed at odds with the murky circumstances surrounding Dr. Fallow's death. Miss Marple stood at Mrs. Wellesley's garden gate, observing the play of sunlight on dew-drenched roses while her friend relayed the latest developments. Inspector Graves has found something quite damning, I'm afraid, Mrs. Wellesley said, her voice hushed. Despite the absence of neighboring ears, traces of the poison in Mr. Trent's workstation. Everyone in the village is saying it's as good as solved. How very convenient, Miss Marple remarked, tilting her head slightly as she considered a particularly fine specimen of climbing rose. Perhaps too convenient. In my experience, evidence that presents itself so readily is often like poor Mrs. Ellsworth's pearl necklace. Mrs. Wellesley blinked in confusion. Pearl necklace? Yes, the one she claimed had been stolen by her maid. It was found in the maid's apron pocket the very next day. Everyone assumed the girl's guilt until it was discovered that Mrs. Ellsworth herself had placed it there after misplacing the real necklace while intoxicated. She was too embarrassed to admit her error and found it easier to suggest theft. Before Miss Wellesley could respond to this seemingly tangential anecdote, they were interrupted by the vicar's wife, who brought with her a tide of additional village gossip. Miss Marple excused herself, mentioning a desire to visit the village library. The library, a modest building of weathered stone, was presided over by Miss Perkins, a spinster of formidable memory and incisive tongue, who had known Eliza Fallow in her youth. Such a brilliant girl, Miss Perkins recalled, after Miss Marple had delicately steered the conversation toward the Fallow family. First-class mind for botany, published several papers before she was 25, under her initials, E.M. Fallow. So many assumed the author was a man. Then her parents died, leaving her to care for young Edwin, and her academic pursuits seemed to fade away. How interesting, Miss Marple murmured. I had rather gathered that Dr. Fallow was the only botanist in the family. Miss Perkins sniffed disapprovingly. That became the accepted narrative over time. Eliza herself seemed to encourage it, always speaking of Edwin's brilliance and Edwin's discoveries. But those of us who remember her early promise often wondered, armed with this illuminating perspective, Miss Marple made her way to Kingswood Manor once again, this time finding Professor Jameson exiting as she arrived. The professor, his tweed jacket slightly rumpled and his expression troubled, paused when Miss Marple introduced herself. Ah, yes, The lady staying with Augusta Wellesley, he studied her with the critical eye of an academic assessing a new specimen. You've taken an interest in Fallow's death, I understand. Merely the natural curiosity of a visitor caught up in local events, Miss Marple demurred. Though I did wonder about the professional relationship between yourself and Dr. Fallow. Jameson's mouth tightened beneath his neatly trimmed mustache. Competitive, certainly. Contentious, occasionally. But I respected his work, or rather, the work that came from his greenhouse. He hesitated, glancing back at the house. Between ourselves, I've long suspected that Edwin's sister contributed far more to his research than he acknowledged. Eliza has an exceptional mind, particularly regarding the chemical properties of rare botanical specimens. I once offered her a position as my research assistant, but she declined, said her brother needed her. This confirmation of Eliza's unacknowledged expertise added another dimension to Miss Marple's growing understanding of the household dynamics. Upon entering the manor, she was greeted by Mrs. Nichols, the housekeeper, whose red-rimmed eyes suggested genuine grief. I've come to speak with Miss Fallow if she's receiving visitors, Miss Marple explained. She's resting upstairs, poor soul, Mrs. Nichols replied, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. These past days have been most trying. First the doctor's death, then the police tramping through the house, and now all this business with Mr. Trent, likely to be arrested. With gentle questioning that disguised its purpose beneath expressions of sympathy, Miss Marple learned that Mrs. Nichols had been with the family for over 20 years and harbored a maternal affection for Eliza, such a devoted sister, always putting his needs before her own. Though between ourselves, she lowered her voice. She'd often go to the greenhouse late at night when the doctor was away. My only moments of peace, she once told me. The housekeeper's reminiscences were interrupted by Inspector Graves's arrival, with a constable in tow. They headed directly to Dr. Fallow's study, emerging some time later with a leather-bound notebook. Evidence, Miss Marple, Graves announced with satisfaction when he encountered her in the hallway. Dr. Fallow's research journal contains coded notes about his experiments and potentially about threats he perceived. The university's botanical department is helping us decipher it. After the police departed, Miss Marple found herself alone in the drawing room with an unexpected opportunity. A bookshelf near where she sat contained a volume that had been hastily replaced, a collection of Victorian poetry with a pressed flower serving as a bookmark. The flower, she noted with interest, was from an orchid variety known for its toxicity when improperly handled. As she carefully examined the brittle specimen, her mind returned to the Harrington case in St. Mary Mead. Oh, Mrs. Harrington had systematically poisoned her brother over months while presenting the very picture of devoted care. The similarities were striking, years of living in another's shadow, of sublimating one's own talents to support another's glory, all while maintaining the perfect facade of selfless dedication. You're still here, Miss Marple. Eliza's voice from the doorway carried a note of surprise, perhaps even alarm. Miss Marple turned, the book still open in her hands. Such a lovely edition of Tennyson. I noticed the pressed orchid, a rare specimen, is it not? One whose sap has certain properties when distilled correctly. Something flickered in Eliza's eyes, a momentary calculation, quickly masked. You seem to know something of botany yourself. Oh, merely the observations of an old woman with too much time for reading, Miss Marple replied with a self-deprecating smile. Though I've always found it fascinating how certain plants can heal or harm depending on who handles them, and how. Eliza crossed to a side table and poured herself a small glass of sherry, her back to Miss Marple. When she turned, her composure had been meticulously restored. My brother's expertise in such matters was unparalleled. His notes on the subject would have been revolutionary had he lived to publish them. His notes, Miss Marple echoed thoughtfully. Or perhaps someone else's. Chapter 4, A Pattern of Devotion. A light rain pattered against the window panes of Mrs. Wellesley's cottage as Miss Marple sat at the breakfast table, methodically arranging newspaper clippings and notes she had collected. The morning paper lay open beside her teacup, its headline announcing, "Arrest imminent in botanist murder. Inspector Graves seems quite determined to charge young Mr. Trent," Mrs. Wellesley observed, peering over her spectacles at the article. "Such a pity. He seemed a pleasant sort of young man." "Yes," agreed Miss Marple, her fingers tracing the edge of a yellowed botanical journal she had borrowed from the village library. "The evidence does appear persuasive. The traces of poison, the argument over credit, his knowledge of toxic plants, all very neat and tidy." "But you don't believe it," Mrs. Wellesley stated rather than asked, having known her friend long enough to recognize the particular gleam in her pale blue eyes. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I'm reminded of Mrs. Bantry's garden. Everything arranged in perfect rows, not a weed in sight. Too perfect, you see. Nature isn't so orderly without considerable intervention." After breakfast, despite the continuing drizzle, Miss Marple made her way to the village records office, where birth certificates, educational records, and local publications were archived in dusty cabinets. The clerk, initially reluctant to disturb these seldom requested materials, was eventually persuaded by Miss Marple's gentle persistence. "Eliza Margaret Fallow," Miss Marple murmured, examining a graduation notice from 1907. "First-class honors in botanical sciences from Jerton College. Recipient of the Winterson Prize for her paper on cellular adaptations in tropical Orchidaceae. Most impressive." Further investigation revealed several scholarly articles published under the name E.M. Fallow in respected scientific journals between 1908 and 1911, followed by a curious silence. This coincided precisely with the first publications of Edwin Fallow, whose early work focused on remarkably similar areas of research. The rain had stopped by the time Miss Marple left the records office, leaving behind a freshly washed landscape of vibrant greens and glistening stone. Her path took her past the church, where she encountered the elderly gardener who tended both the churchyard and, on occasion, the grounds of Kingswood Manor. "Terrible business about Dr. Fallow," he commented, leaning on his rake. "Though between ourselves, miss, there's some might say it was a long time coming." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's tone was one of polite interest, though her attention had sharpened considerably. The gardener glanced around before continuing in a lowered voice. "I've worked at the Manor, off and on, for 15 years. Seen things, I have. The way he'd take her notes. Miss Eliza's, that is, and call them his own. Once heard him saying to her, 'No one would credit a woman with such insights, Eliza. Better they come from me.' Cold as you please, as if he were doing her a favor." This confirmation of her suspicions sent Miss Marple directly to Kingswood Manor, where she found Michael Trent in the greenhouse, frantically examining Dr. Fallow's records. His startled expression upon her entrance quickly transformed to resignation. "Inspector Graves will be returning with an arrest warrant this afternoon," he informed her, pushing his spectacles up with an agitated gesture. "Apparently, the poison has been positively identified from my workbench samples." "How very conclusive," Miss Marple remarked, moving to examine the central display where the famous new hybrid still sat beneath its glass dome. "Tell me, Mr. Trent, whose work is this orchid, really Dr. Fallow's or his sister's?" Michael's eyes widened slightly before he glanced toward the door. "Why do you ask?" "I've been studying Dr. Fallow's notebook, or rather, studying what others have said about it. The coding isn't particularly complex, is it? Simply the botanical classification system with a personal cipher applied. Something any trained botanist might devise." "Miss Fallow helped with the research," Michael admitted reluctantly, "but the final breakthrough with this hybrid was genuinely Dr. Fallow's achievement." "Was it?" Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "The notebook contains references to nocturnal experiments, does it not? Yet, Dr. Fallow was known to retire early." Mrs. Nichols mentioned Miss Fallow's late-night visits to the greenhouse when her brother was away, Before Michael could respond, a constable arrived to inform him that his presence was required at the village police station immediately. Left alone in the greenhouse, Miss Marple took the opportunity to examine the soil in several pots, particularly those placed somewhat apart from the main collection. "Most illuminating," she murmured to herself, noting the distinctive composition of one particular mixture, designed, an experienced gardener might recognize, to cultivate plants with specific toxic properties under carefully controlled conditions. Later that afternoon, she arranged to meet Inspector Graves at the tea shop in the village square, a neutral territory where she might present her findings without the emotionally charged atmosphere of Kingswood Manor. "I've indulged your interference thus far out of respect for Superintendent Blackwell," Inspector Graves stated flatly as he took a seat opposite her. "But we have solid evidence against Mr. Trent. The case is all but closed." "And yet," Miss Marple replied, pouring tea with a steady hand, "you have overlooked several critical facts. The first being that Eliza Fallow, not her brother, was the true botanical genius in that household. That's hardly relevant. It establishes motive, Inspector. Decades of stolen credit, of living in the shadow of a mediocre man who appropriated her brilliance as his own. And more immediately, the new hybrid, the crowning achievement that would have cemented Dr. Fallow's reputation forever, was entirely her creation." Graves frowned. "You can't possibly know that. The soil compositions in the greenhouse tell their own story. The hybrid required specific nocturnal care that Dr. Fallow, with his rigid schedules, never provided. And then there's this." She withdrew from her handbag a photocopy of an old scientific paper. "Eliza Fallow's early work on orchid hybridization, the theoretical foundation for the very technique that produced the famous new specimen published 20 years ago, and then forgotten." As Miss Marple continued to outline her theory, connecting evidence that had seemed disparate into a cohesive pattern, she was reminded vividly of the Harrington case, the years of resentment hidden beneath a veneer of devoted care, the careful cultivation of a public persona that made suspicion seem unthinkable. "And finally, Inspector," she concluded, "there is the matter of the locked greenhouse door, a simple deception. The door was locked after the murder, not before. Fallow's body was discovered by Mrs. Nichols, who found him slumped among his orchids. But before raising the alarm, someone took the key from his pocket, exited, and locked the door from the outside to create the illusion of a locked room mystery." Inspector Graves's expression had gradually shifted from skepticism to troubled consideration. "If what you're suggesting is true, then the evidence against Mr. Trent was planted," Miss Marple confirmed, "by someone with intimate knowledge of both the poison and the greenhouse, someone who needed a convenient suspect to divert attention from herself." "Miss Fallow," Graves murmured, the pieces finally falling into place in his mind. "A brilliant woman," Miss Marple said softly, "who decided that after a lifetime in the shadows, she would finally claim the recognition she deserved, beginning with her brother's greatest achievement, which was in truth her own." As they walked together toward Kingswood Manor, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the gravel drive, not unlike the shadow that had stretched across Eliza Fallow's life for so many years. Miss Marple thought again of the Harrington case, of how a pattern of devotion had concealed the darkest of resentments until it was too late. "It's often the quietest ones," she observed to Inspector Graves, "who harbor the deepest wounds, and who plan their vengeance with the greatest patience." Chapter 5. The Final Bloom. The drawing-room at Kingswood Manor was bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, dust motes dancing in the slanting sunbeams that fell across the Persian carpet. Eliza Fallow sat in her customary chair, her posture as rigid as ever, though something in her eyes had changed since Miss Marple had first encountered her, a certain watchfulness that suggested a fox sensing the approach of hounds. "Miss Fallow," Inspector Graves began formally, after the initial pleasantries had been exchanged, "we have some questions regarding your brother's death that require clarification." "I've answered all your questions already, Inspector," Eliza replied, her voice steady. Surely your time would be better spent preparing your case against Mr. Trent. Miss Marple, who had taken a seat near the window where the light illuminated her knitting, made a small sound that might have been disagreement. I've been thinking, Miss Fallow, about your early work in botany. Such promising research, especially your papers on the chemical properties of tropical orchids. A flicker of surprise crossed Eliza's face before her expression settled back into careful neutrality. That was a lifetime ago. My brother's work soon eclipsed my modest contributions to the field. Did it? Miss Marple's needles continued their rhythmic movement, or did he simply claim your contributions as his own? The gardener remembers hearing quite telling conversations between you. Old Jenkins has always been prone to confusion and exaggeration. Eliza dismissed, though her fingers had tightened around the arm of her chair. Inspector Graves cleared his throat uncomfortably. Miss Fallow, we have evidence suggesting that the toxin used to poison your brother was cultivated here, in a separate section of the greenhouse, using techniques that require considerable expertise. As I've said, Mr. Trent had both the knowledge and the motive. Mr. Trent, Miss Marple interrupted gently, was arguing with your brother about receiving proper credit for his assistance with the new hybrid. But the hybrid itself wasn't your brother's work at all, was it? It was yours, just as most of his celebrated discoveries over the years were actually your work. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the soft click of Miss Marple's knitting needles. Outside, a blackbird trilled its evening song, oblivious to the human drama unfolding within the walls of Kingswood Manor. You have no proof of such absurd allegations, Eliza finally said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. Actually, I believe we do, Miss Marple countered, setting aside her knitting and extracting several papers from her handbag. Your early publications show a theoretical framework for precisely the kind of hybridization that produced the new orchid. The notebook your brother kept, with its coded entries, uses the same cipher system you developed in your university days, documented in the archives at Girton College. Inspector Graves, following Miss Marple's lead, added, and the soil analysis from the greenhouse confirms that the toxic plants were cultivated using methods detailed in your early papers on botanical toxicology, papers published under your initials. Furthermore, Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but relentless, there is the matter of the locked greenhouse door. It was locked after your brother's death, not before, a simple deception to suggest a mystery where none existed. You administered the poison through his special tea, knowing the symptoms would mimic contamination from the greenhouse plants. Eliza's face had grown progressively paler as Miss Marple spoke, the careful mask of devoted sister slipping to reveal glimpses of the brilliant, thwarted woman beneath. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a new quality, a cold precision that had perhaps always been there, hidden beneath layers of assumed deference. He was going to present my work. Again, the culmination of 5 years of research. My research would have cemented his reputation forever. Her hands, no longer clasped demurely, moved with expressive emphasis. Do you have any idea what it's like, Miss Marple, to watch someone else claim credit for your life's work, to stand in the shadows year after year, hearing your own ideas praised as the brilliance of another? I can only imagine, Miss Marple replied softly. Though the Harrington case in St. Mary Mead showed me how such circumstances can distort a person's sense of justice over time. Justice, Eliza echoed, a bitter smile twisting her lips. Edwin always said it was for the best, that the scientific community would never fully accept insights from a woman, that by presenting my work as his own, he was doing me a favor. Her laugh held no humor. He genuinely believed it, I think, but was the most intolerable part. Inspector Graves shifted uncomfortably. Miss Fallow, I must caution you that anything you say may be used as evidence. Evidence? Eliza's voice rose slightly. There's evidence of my brother's theft scattered throughout decades of publications. Compare his early work with his later papers after our parents died and I became his devoted sister. The stylistic differences are glaring. Even his colleagues suspected the truth. Professor Jameson offered me a position once. Did you know? Said my talents were wasted as Edwin's housekeeper. Yet you stayed, Miss Marple observed. Where else could I go? What could I do? My reputation had been subsumed into his. My research was published under his name. Eliza's composure was crumbling now, years of resentment breaking through the carefully maintained facade. And then the new hybrid, my greatest achievement. He was going to present it to the Royal Botanical Society as his own discovery, his crowning achievement. She rose suddenly, moving to the window where the greenhouse was visible in the distance, its glass panes reflecting the setting sun in a blaze of copper and gold. I cultivated the papillion and the virens separately, extracted the compound with a process I developed myself. It was elegant, really, untraceable to anyone who didn't understand my methods. And you planted evidence to implicate Mr. Trent, Inspector Graves stated, the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. He was convenient, Eliza acknowledged with a dismissive gesture, always complaining about proper credit. I simply provided a more significant grievance. As Inspector Graves began the formal process of arrest, reading Eliza her rights in a tone that suggested reluctant admiration for her intellect, even as he condemned her actions, Miss Marple gathered her knitting with a small sigh. The case had unfolded much as she had expected from the moment she observed the inconsistencies in the greenhouse arrangement, the careful deception of the locked door, the too convenient evidence against Michael Trent. 2 weeks later, Miss Marple and Mrs. Wellesley sat in the latter's garden, enjoying the early summer sunshine. The newspapers had been full of the case, with particular emphasis on the discovery that many of Dr. Edwin Fallow's celebrated contributions to botanical science had in fact been his sister's work. The university has announced they're reviewing all of Dr. Fallow's publications, Mrs. Wellesley reported, pouring tea. They're likely to reattribute many of them to Eliza, a posthumous recognition of sorts, though she won't be there to see it. And Mr. Trent has been appointed curator of the orchid collection, Miss Marple added. I understand he's insisted that the new hybrid be named in recognition of its true creator, Orchidaceae Elizabetha. Mrs. Wellesley nodded. A fitting tribute, despite everything. Such a tragedy. All those years of brilliance hidden behind her brother's reputation. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the climbing roses along the garden wall, their pattern of growth seemingly random yet governed by internal laws, as precise as any scientific principle. The Harrington case was my guide, you know. The same pattern of apparent devotion, concealing years of growing resentment. Mrs. Harrington, too, maintained the perfect facade of the caring sister, while methodically planning her brother's demise. But how did you know it wasn't Mr. Trent? Mrs. Wellesley asked. The evidence against him seemed quite compelling. Too compelling, Miss Marple replied, setting down her teacup. And there was something in Eliza's manner, that particular quality of devotion, that seemed almost rehearsed. Mary Mead, one learns to recognize when deference has become a mask for deeper feelings. As they sat in companionable silence, Miss Marple reflected on the orchid that had been at the center of the case, beautiful, rare, and deadly in its implications. Like Eliza herself, it had been cultivated in shadow, its true nature hidden until its final, fatal bloom revealed the truth that had been there all along, waiting for someone with the patience and perspective to see beyond appearances to the complex human reality beneath. The saddest part, Miss Marple observed as the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the garden, is that Eliza Fallow might have been remembered as a brilliant botanist in her own right, had she not allowed resentment to bloom into something far more toxic than any orchid she ever cultivated. Mrs. Wellesley nodded solemnly. A lifetime of stolen credit, and a moment of fatal recognition, Miss Marple concluded softly. when she decided that if she could not have the acknowledgment she deserved in her brother's lifetime, she would claim it after his death. She paused, her eyes distant with the wisdom of one who has observed the infinite variations of human behavior in the microcosm of village life. The most dangerous resentments, my dear, are those that grow in the shadow of apparent devotion. They take root so deeply that, in time, they become capable of flowering into the most meticulously planned acts of vengeance. The setting sun cast a final golden glow across the garden as the two elderly women contemplated the tragedy of Kingswood Manor, how a lifetime of dedication had concealed the darkest of intentions, and how the most beautiful of creations had emerged from the most poisonous of circumstances.